packed Rayburn hearing room, AOC steps out of her seat to deliver the viral immigrant kill shot she's perfected for years, only to run into FBI Director Kash Patel, a calm trial lawyer with a binder full of receipts and a resume she didn't see coming. One answer flips the room, the cameras, and the narrative. Subscribe now, because what Patel reads next changes everything. The hearing room in the Rayburn building was already full before sunrise, the kind of full that signaled something more than routine oversight, something closer to spectacle. Every seat was taken. The press gallery was pressed shoulder to shoulder, and the low murmur of anticipation had the brittle edge of a crowd waiting for a fight. This was not an obscure subcommittee or a sleepy budget markup. This was a stage, and everyone in the room knew it. By 9:45, the cameras were live, the Chiron writers were ready, and social media teams across Washington had their fingers hovering over keyboards. The hashtag had already been chosen, already formatted, already scheduled. In an era when congressional hearings were less about extracting information and more about manufacturing moments, this one had all the ingredients: high emotion, immigration, the FBI, and the most media-savvy member of Congress on one side of the dais. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez arrived through the main corridor flanked by colleagues, her pace measured, her posture deliberate. She wore a red blazer that cut sharply against the dark wood of the hallway, a color chosen not for comfort but for contrast. Every detail of her appearance had been considered, from the earrings sourced from a Bronx small business to the thick folder she carried under her arm. The folder's label, written in bold marker, faced outward toward the cameras. Accountability. She paused briefly at the door to offer a statement to the press, her voice calm, confident, and already halfway into performance mode. Today, she said, Congress would hold this administration accountable for its war on immigrant families. The phrasing was precise, tested, and familiar to anyone who followed her online. It was the opening line of a story she had told before, one that reliably generated clicks, clips, and contributions. Inside the hearing room, staffers were already in motion, passing notes, adjusting microphones, checking timers. AOC took her seat, placed the folder on the desk in front of her, and glanced briefly at the witness table. She did not linger on the man who would soon occupy it. In her mind, he was already defined, already flattened into a role. He was the Trump-aligned FBI director, the political operative with a badge, the perfect foil for a viral takedown. 3 blocks away, in an office at FBI headquarters, Kash Patel sat quietly at a conference table with a binder open in front of him. The binder was thick, heavy with documents, and divided by color-coded tabs: blue, red, green, yellow. Each tab represented a different category, a different line of attack he expected to face. He was not rehearsing lines or practicing zingers. He was reviewing records, transcripts, filings, and reports, the kind of material that rarely trends, but always endures. Patel had seen the previews on cable news, the speculation about how brutal the hearing would be, how aggressive the questioning. He watched without expression, the volume turned low. He did not underestimate AOC's ability to command a room. He had studied her hearings the way a trial lawyer studies opposing counsel, not for ideology, but for pattern. She always built to an emotional crescendo, always ended with a question designed to trap the witness in a moral vice. His general counsel sat across from him, flipping through her own notes, while the deputy director leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. They spoke in short sentences, almost shorthand. Families first, then qualifications, then the emotional closer. Patel nodded along, already ahead of them. He had no intention of interrupting her, no intention of challenging the premise of her questions in real time. He would let her speak. He would let her build. And then he would answer. Back in Rayburn, Chairman Jim Jordan brought the committee to order, his gavel striking the wood with a sharp crack that cut through the room. The opening statements were procedural, dense, and quickly forgotten. Members spoke about law enforcement priorities, border security, counterterrorism. Patel had not yet entered, but his name hung in the air, framed by expectation and assumption. When he did enter, it was through a side door, without fanfare or entourage. He wore a navy suit, no tie, and carried the binder under one arm. He did not look toward the cameras as he took his seat at the witness table. He adjusted the microphone, placed the binder to his left, and folded his hands neatly in front of him. To a casual observer, he might have looked like an accountant arriving for an audit, rather than a man about to be interrogated on national television. The contrast was striking and intentional. On one side of the room sat a congresswoman known for turning hearings into viral events, her every gesture calibrated for maximum reach. On the other sat a witness whose demeanor suggested process rather than performance. One wanted the hearing to feel like a confrontation. The other wanted it to feel like a record. The first 90 minutes unfolded exactly as expected and exactly as AOC had planned. Republican members asked about arrest statistics, cartel activity, fentanyl seizures. Patel answered with numbers, dates, and locations. He spoke in full sentences, without flourish, citing figures that were impressive but uncinematic. The room listened politely. The cameras rolled dutifully, and the audience waited. This was the necessary prelude, the slow build-up that made the eventual clash feel sharper by contrast. AOC watched from her seat, occasionally jotting notes she did not need, her mind already several steps ahead. She knew the rhythm of these hearings, knew when attention began to drift, when viewers at home started to check their phones. By the time her turn came, the room would be ready for something human. Her chief of staff had said it that morning with a smile. "They're hungry for fireworks." She believed him because it was always true. Hearings were not about information anymore. They were about moments, and she was better at manufacturing them than anyone else in Congress. As Patel spoke about seizures and arrests, she glanced briefly at the binder beside him, thick and unopened. She dismissed it without thinking. Witnesses always brought binders. They were props, security blankets, talismans against scrutiny. What mattered was not what was in the binder, but what would be said on camera, and she controlled that terrain. When the chair finally recognized the gentlewoman from New York, the room seemed to tighten. AOC straightened in her chair, adjusted her microphone, and for a brief moment looked directly at Patel. Not at the camera yet. That would come later. This was the opening, the setup, the moment before the turn. "Director Patel," she began, her tone measured but edged with urgency. "Since you took over the FBI, your agency has participated in what can only be described as a mass dragnet targeting immigrant communities." The words were familiar, drawn from speeches and posts that had already reached millions. ICE raids in residential neighborhoods, agents showing up at schools, parents detained in front of their children. Is this the FBI you're proud of? It was the first move in a sequence she had run many times before. Establish the human cost. Force the witness to either agree, conceding cruelty, or disagree, appearing heartless. Either outcome would work. Either would clip well. She watched him closely, ready to pivot if he hesitated, ready to press if he deflected. Patel leaned slightly toward the microphone, his movement unhurried, almost casual. "Congresswoman," he said, "I appreciate the question. Let me give you some context for those operations." He did not raise his voice or narrow his eyes. He did not rush to reassure or apologize. He spoke as if he were explaining a file to a judge. As he began to cite numbers, AOC felt a flicker of irritation. This was not the response she wanted, but it was not yet dangerous. Numbers could be brushed aside. Statistics could be reframed. She had done it before. Interrupting witnesses. Redirecting to the human story. She let him speak for the moment. Confident she could regain control. He continued, listing arrests, violent criminal histories, gang affiliations, fentanyl seizures. He spoke about victims in immigrant communities, about people preyed upon by transnational gangs. He spoke about safety, about law enforcement as protection rather than persecution. It was competent, even persuasive, but still dry, still beatable. When she cut him off, reminding him that she had not asked about fentanyl, the room stirred slightly. This was the familiar pivot point, the moment where she would pull the conversation back to emotion. She did not yet realize that something had shifted, that the script she was following had already begun to slip. Patel answered her interruption without offense, without edge, and then moved on. He did not chase her framing. He did not apologize for his facts. He simply placed them on the record and looked back at her, waiting. It was a small thing, barely perceptible, but it mattered. He was not reacting to her. He was allowing her to react to him. As she prepared to move to her next question, AOC felt the need to accelerate, to reassert tempo. She pivoted toward the webinar, toward the accusation that had been preloaded in her notes. This was still within the plan. This was still ground she believed she controlled. What she did not yet know, what no one on her team had fully grasped, was that the man sitting at the witness table had been waiting for this exact moment. He had not guessed her words, but he knew the pattern. And in the binder to his left, under a yellow tab, was the document that would begin to turn the hearing from a performance into something else entirely. The cameras continued to roll, the timer on her microphone counting down in red digits. The room leaned forward, sensing that the real exchange was just beginning. What neither side yet understood, at least not fully, was that the next few minutes would not just define the hearing. They would redefine who was asking the questions and who would be forced to answer them. AOC moved into her second line of questioning with the practiced ease of someone who had done this dozens of times before. Her cadence tightening, her sentences shortening, her tone shifting from explanatory to prosecutorial. She framed the webinar as a civic service, a Know Your Rights session meant to empower vulnerable communities, and she framed the criticism of it as intimidation, an attempt to silence an elected official for reading the Constitution out loud. It was a familiar move, one that usually forced witnesses to retreat or hedge. Patel did neither. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if marking the point in the transcript he had already memorized. He thanked her for raising the issue, a phrase that sounded polite but carried a subtle warning, and then asked the chairman for permission to read directly from the document in question. When Jordan nodded, Patel reached for the binder for the first time, opened it deliberately, and slid the yellow tab forward with his thumb. The room changed when he did that. It was not dramatic, not audible, but perceptible in the way people adjusted in their seats, the way staffers stopped whispering, the way a few reporters leaned closer to their laptops. Witnesses rarely read documents in hearings like this. They summarized, paraphrased, deflected. Reading meant commitment. Reading meant the words would enter the record exactly as written. Patel's voice was flat, almost clinical, as he quoted the line about resisting and creating friction. He did not emphasize the words or pause for effect. He let them stand on their own, stripped of context and tone, rendered as text. When he finished, he closed the binder and looked up at her, his expression unchanged. He did not accuse her of malice. He did not question her intentions. Instead, he explained, slowly and precisely, what those words meant in practice, how they would be interpreted by law enforcement, how they would play out in the real lives of undocumented people who followed them. He spoke about obstruction charges, about resisting arrest, about the way a single additional count could collapse an asylum claim or foreclose prosecutorial discretion. This was not an argument about ideology. It was an argument about consequences. AOC felt it immediately, the way the ground beneath a line of attack can suddenly feel unstable. She had expected outrage, denial, maybe even a defensive appeal to authority. She had not expected a former public defender to walk her audience through the downstream legal effects of her own rhetoric. She glanced briefly toward her staff, then back at Patel, her jaw tightening. She pivoted again, faster this time, her voice rising just slightly as she moved to the question of qualifications. This was the line she trusted most, the one that framed him as an unqualified political appointee, a partisan actor wearing a law enforcement title. She delivered the accusations in rapid succession, a technique designed to overwhelm, to force a witness to choose which charge to answer and which to leave hanging. Patel waited until she finished. He did not interrupt. He did not object. He let the silence stretch for a moment that felt longer than it was, the kind of pause that draws attention simply by existing. Then he began, not by defending himself in abstract terms, but by narrating his career in chronological order, each step grounded in dates, roles, and responsibilities. He spoke about Miami-Dade County, about representing indigent defendants in one of the busiest criminal courts in the country. He spoke about murder trials, narcotics cases, fraud. He spoke about clients who did not speak English, about holding cells and late nights, about the constitutional obligation to provide counsel regardless of status. His tone remained even, almost instructional, as if he were explaining a resume to a hiring committee rather than responding to an attack. As he moved through his time at the Department of Justice, his words grew denser, more technical, but no less controlled. He mentioned terrorism cases, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, federal court. He did not linger on heroics or outcomes, only on process, on the work itself. When he reached his time on the House Intelligence Committee and the National Security Council, he framed it not as politics, but as oversight and execution, investigations conducted and operations overseen. Then, without changing tone, he placed her resume next to his. He did not insult her background or belittle her path. He stated it plainly, as one set of facts alongside another. Education, employment, election. No embellishment, no sarcasm. The effect was devastating precisely because it was so restrained. The comparison did not need commentary. It sat there, unresolved, forcing the audience to draw its own conclusions. AOC felt the moment slipping. She could sense it in the room, in the way the energy had shifted away from her, in the way Patel had turned her accusation into an audit. She had opened a door she could not close, and she knew it. The timer on her microphone ticked down, and with it, her margin for recovery. She reached for the last card, the one she had never lost with before. The emotional appeal. The immigrant story. the question designed to override facts with feeling. Her voice softened as she asked it, the anger drained away and replaced with something closer to sorrow. She stood as she spoke, breaking the unspoken rules of the room, because the moment demanded it. Because the cameras demanded it. "Do you have any idea what it is like," she asked, "to be an immigrant in this country right now?" The room was silent as she spoke. The kind of silence that feels performative in its own way, shaped by anticipation. This was the line that would clip, the line that would travel, the line that would erase whatever came before it. She had delivered it before, and it had always worked. Patel did not rush to answer. He leaned forward slightly, his hands still folded, and spoke about his parents, about their arrival from India, about a house in Garden City that was smaller than the hearing room. He spoke about his father's degree not being recognized, about starting over. He paused, not for drama, but for precision. And then he spoke about Miami again, about representing immigrants as a public defender, about making sure they had lawyers. As he spoke, something in the room recalibrated. This was not a counterattack. It was a claim to the moral high ground she had assumed was hers by default. He did not deny her empathy. He did not question her concern. He simply established his own experience, quietly, thoroughly, and without flourish. Then he turned the question back on her. He spoke about the difference between protecting immigrants through legal representation and endangering them through rhetoric. He spoke about fundraising emails and viral clips, about using fear as fuel. He did not accuse her of cynicism outright, but the implication hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. The timer on her microphone reached 0. The red light went dark. Her 5 minutes were over. She sat down slowly, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed on the desk in front of her. For the first time in her congressional career, she did not have a response ready, not because there was nothing she could say, but because anything she said would have required her to acknowledge the record he had just built. Chairman Jordan waited a beat, then asked Patel if he had anything to add for the record. Patel straightened the papers in front of him and spoke briefly, reiterating that he had answered every question put to him. He noted, calmly, that none of his had been answered in return. He closed his binder. The hearing moved on, but the moment had passed. Reporters were already filing out. Staffers were already texting. Producers were already cutting clips. The performance AOC had planned had been overtaken by something else, something slower and harder to spin. She remained in her seat as the next member spoke, her phone buzzing unanswered in her bag. 3 floors up, in her office, her communications team stared at their screens in silence. The draft fundraising email sat unsent, its subject line no longer matching reality. On social media, the clips were already spreading, but they were not hers. What had happened in the hearing room was not a shouting match or a scandal. It was something more subtle and more dangerous, a reversal of roles. The questioner had become the subject, and the subject had controlled the record. And once the record is set, no amount of performance can change what it shows. The hallway outside the Judiciary Committee room filled faster than anyone expected. Reporters spilling out with phones already raised, voices overlapping as producers barked instructions through earpieces. The hearing itself technically continued, but the gravitational center had shifted. The real story was no longer unfolding at the dais. It was already moving, clip by clip, into the wider bloodstream of the internet. Inside the room, AOC sat rigid, her hands folded too tightly on the desk. Rashida Tlaib leaned toward her and whispered something meant to steady her, but AOC did not turn. Jamal Bowman sat a few rows back, arms crossed, jaw set, scanning the Republican side for any sign of triumph he could later frame as cruelty or arrogance. He found plenty of smiles, some barely concealed, others unabashed. He took no photos. For once, there was no angle to work. Patel remained at the witness table as the next member launched into a question about fentanyl interdiction. He answered with the same measured tone, the same data-driven precision, as if nothing of consequence had just occurred. To him, the hearing was still a hearing. The fact that the narrative had already escaped the room did not change the task in front of him. He spoke, listened, and spoke again, building a record line by line. In AOC's Longworth office, Maya Torres sat frozen in front of 3 screens. One showed the live feed, now visually unremarkable. Another showed social media analytics updating in real time, numbers climbing faster than she had ever seen on a clip that was not theirs. The third showed the draft email still open, its subject line blinking accusingly at the top of the page. She deleted it. She opened a new document and began typing a different frame, one that cast the exchange as an attack, as persecution, as an abuse of power. She stopped halfway through the first paragraph. The words felt thin. The footage did not support them. This was the problem with facts on camera. They left little room to maneuver. She called the chief of staff. He did not answer on the first ring. Back in the hearing room, Chairman Jordan called a brief recess. Members stood, clustered, spoke in hushed tones. AOC rose slowly, her movements controlled, and made her way toward the hallway. Cameras surged toward her immediately, microphones extending like a thicket of black stems. She delivered the statement her team had prepared, her voice steady, her language sharp. "What you saw today," she said, "was a political operative using the power of the FBI to attack a woman of color who dares to hold this administration accountable." She spoke of intimidation, of fascism, of silencing dissent. The words landed cleanly, the cadence familiar, the framing textbook. But the reporters did not move. They waited. One asked whether the Ethics Committee findings Patel cited were inaccurate. Another asked about the webinar transcript. A third asked why she had not addressed the PAC money issue directly. She deflected, reframed, repeated her central message. She did not answer the questions. When the press conference ended, she walked away without looking back. Within the hour, the first clip crossed 10 million views. It was 37 seconds long, Patel's voice calm and uninflected as he described defending immigrants in court, while accusing her of endangering them through rhetoric. The caption varied by account, but the effect was the same. It was clipped cleanly, without editorializing, and it spread with the efficiency of something that did not require explanation. The second clip followed quickly. 22 seconds. "Tax the rich," he said, at an event where tickets cost $35,000. "You accepted the dress for free. Someone paired it with music. Someone else added subtitles. Someone else juxtaposed it with images from the Met Gala. The meme mutated and multiplied. The third clip was longer, denser, and slower to travel, but it proved more damaging over time. Patel reading the numbers, the transfers, the PACs and LLCs, the FEC vote. It required attention, but those who watched it felt rewarded. Screenshots. Her social media bio appeared next to screenshots of filings. The contrast did the work. Progressive media moved quickly to contain the damage. Headlines framed the exchange as an ambush, as partisan theater, as an abuse of authority. Cable panels debated tone rather than substance. Surrogates went on air to praise AOC's courage and condemn Patel's tactics. But all of it ran up against the same obstacle. The footage existed, uncut, and widely available. Spin works best when the audience has not already seen the thing being spun. In the Bronx, the reaction was quieter, but more consequential. A local news crew set up outside a bodega on Westchester Avenue. The camera angled to catch foot traffic and the hum of the street. The owner, a Dominican woman who had lived there for 3 decades, spoke plainly. She said the dress cost more than her rent for a year. She said she had voted for AOC 3 times. She said she was tired. A young man who worked at a nearby car wash told a different story, his voice tight with frustration. He spoke about a cousin who had followed the advice from the webinar, who had resisted, who had been charged with obstruction. He did not use ideological language. He spoke about consequences. A retired school teacher who had canvassed for AOC in her first campaign said she still believed in many of her positions. She also said belief was not enough. She talked about solidarity, about paying people on time, about living the values you preach. Her disappointment was not loud. It was heavy. The internal polling reflected what those interviews hinted at. Favorability dipped among working-class Latino voters, not dramatically, but noticeably. It was not a swing to the right. It was a cooling, a hesitation, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but changes outcomes over time. In Washington, the response from within the Democratic caucus was subtle. Invitations slowed. Joint appearances were postponed. Endorsements were described as under review. No one criticized her publicly. They did not need to. In politics, silence from allies can be louder than any attack from opponents. The damage was not tied to any single allegation. Politicians survive ethics findings. They survive FEC complaints. They survive bad weeks. What was different this time was the pattern Patel had assembled, methodically and without embellishment. A sequence of contradictions laid out in public, each one supported by documents rather than rhetoric. Tax the rich, but accept free designer goods and delay payment until investigated. No corporate PAC money, but nearly $1 million moved through committees and companies controlled by close associates. Stand with immigrants, but encourage resistance that increases legal jeopardy. Claim transparency, but misstate the source of taxpayer funds. None of it was framed as criminal. That restraint mattered. Patel had not accused her of corruption. He had not used loaded language. He had simply placed her words next to the record and allowed the gap to speak for itself. Back at FBI headquarters, Patel returned to his office after the hearing and went back to work. There were case files to review, briefings to attend, decisions to make. He did not post on social media. He did not give interviews. When a reporter reached him for comment, he said only that he had answered the Congresswoman's questions and remained available to answer more. His deputy director remarked later that it was the first time he had seen someone treat a congressional hearing like a courtroom with cameras rather than a studio with witnesses. Patel shrugged it off. Preparation mattered, he said. The record mattered. In the weeks that followed, AOC did what she had always done. She fundraised on the controversy. She released carefully edited clips that showed her questions without his answers. She spoke about persecution and resilience. The machine continued to function. Donations flowed. Followers remained. But something had changed. The shift was not ideological. It was not about policy positions or party loyalty. It was about sincerity. About whether the person speaking believed the words as much as the audience was asked to. Once doubt enters that space, it does not leave easily. Patel never mentioned her race or gender. He never invoked ideology. He never raised his voice. He read documents. He cited reports. He answered questions. In doing so, he reframed the encounter from a clash of values to a test of consistency. She had asked him whether he understood what immigrants faced. He had answered. He had defended them in court. He had represented them when it mattered. The question, he implied, without ever asking directly, was simpler and more difficult. Who actually helped them? The hearing room emptied. The gavel fell again. Officially, the session ended. Unofficially, the story continued, unfolding in timelines, group chats, and living rooms far from Washington. It was not explosive. It was corrosive. The kind of erosion that does not topple a structure overnight, but weakens it all the same. Receipts, once read into the record, do not disappear. And the record, once established on camera, has a way of outlasting performance. In the days after the hearing, Washington settled into its familiar rhythm of reaction and recalibration. Panels debated tone, op-eds parsed intent, and anonymous aides leaked carefully worded defenses to friendly reporters. Yet beneath the noise, something quieter was taking hold, a reassessment that did not announce itself with outrage or applause, but with questions that lingered longer than slogans. For AOC, the immediate aftermath was relentless. Her schedule remained full, her appearances polished, her language sharpened to the edge she had honed over years of public combat. She spoke about intimidation and accountability, about standing up to power, about the necessity of confronting institutions that had failed vulnerable communities. The words were not new, and they still resonated with a large audience. But the echo was different now. The applause came, but it came a half-beat later. Her team adjusted tactics. Clips were trimmed tighter. Context was controlled more aggressively. Fundraising emails leaned into solidarity and defiance. The subject lines still worked. The numbers still came in. And by any conventional metric, the operation remained successful. What could not be measured so easily was the subtle change in how people listened. In quiet conversations, among donors and activists who had once repeated her talking points without hesitation, a new caution appeared. They did not reject her arguments. They weighed them. They asked follow-up questions. They referenced the hearing, sometimes obliquely, sometimes directly. They spoke about consistency, about credibility, about the difference between symbolism and substance. The hearing had not destroyed her brand. It had complicated it. Inside the Democratic caucus, senior members watched closely. No one moved publicly against her. That would have been counterproductive and unnecessary. Instead, they took note of the shift in tone among constituents, of the way moderate voters discussed the exchange. They had seen this pattern before, not with AOC specifically, but with figures whose public image outpaced their private record. The reckoning rarely came all at once. It came in stages. Patel, for his part, remained largely absent from the media cycle. He declined invitations to elaborate or celebrate. He answered questions when asked and returned to the work of running a sprawling federal agency. When colleagues congratulated him on the exchange, he deflected. He did not see it as a victory. He saw it as a hearing conducted the way hearings were supposed to be conducted, with questions answered and facts placed on the record. That distinction mattered to him. He had spent his career in rooms where words carried consequences, where statements were tested against evidence rather than applause. The hearing had felt familiar in that sense, despite the cameras. It was a courtroom with an audience, and he had treated it accordingly. When asked privately whether he had anticipated the reaction, he said he had anticipated scrutiny, not spectacle. The clips going viral were incidental, he insisted. What mattered was that the record now existed, accessible to anyone willing to look beyond the headlines. As the weeks passed, the hearing became a reference point, rather than a headline. Commentators invoked it when discussing the evolution of congressional oversight, the changing nature of political performance, the risks of underestimating an opponent. It was cited in law school classrooms as an example of cross-examination dynamics outside traditional courtrooms. It was discussed in campaign strategy memos as a cautionary tale. The lesson many drew was not partisan. It was procedural. In an environment saturated with messaging, the person who controlled the documentation could still control the outcome. The binder, mocked as a prop by some, had turned out to be the most consequential object in the room. For AOC, the recalibration continued quietly. She did not abandon her approach. That would have been an admission she was unwilling to make. But she adjusted its contours. Future hearings were prepared with deeper opposition research, more attention to background rather than brand. Emotional appeals remained, but they were layered more carefully atop factual scaffolding. She had learned, in a way few politicians ever do, what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a disciplined examination. It was not humiliating. It was unsettling. It forced a recognition that performance alone was not always sufficient, that sometimes the other side came armed not just with talking points but with receipts. In the Bronx, the conversation sparked by the hearing continued at kitchen tables and storefronts. They were not dramatic. They did not trend. They were practical. People spoke about rent, about legal fees, about the difference between advice that felt empowering and advice that made things worse. They did not suddenly reject her. They recalibrated their expectations. That recalibration showed up months later in small ways. Turnout at certain events dipped slightly. Volunteer enthusiasm became more conditional. Support remained, but it was no longer automatic. The footnotes had entered the story. For Patel, the hearing receded into the background of an expanding agenda. Cartel investigations intensified. Counterintelligence cases multiplied. The work grew heavier, not lighter, as global pressures mounted. He did not think often about the exchange unless asked. When he did, he framed it simply. She asked questions. He answered them. That was the job. He did not follow her social media. He did not monitor the clips. He trusted that the record would speak for itself in time to those who cared to listen. He had learned early in his career that the loudest moments were rarely the most important ones. What lingered from the hearing was not the clash itself, but the inversion it revealed. A figure known for asking questions had been confronted with answers she was not prepared to address. A witness expected to deflect had instead documented. The asymmetry that had powered so many viral moments had briefly collapsed, replaced by something closer to parity. That collapse did not upend the political order. It did not end careers. It did not settle debates. What it did was expose a vulnerability in a system that had come to rely too heavily on performance. It reminded viewers that beneath the lighting and the language, there were still files, filings, and transcripts that could not be waved away. The phrase that circulated most persistently after the hearing was not coined by a strategist or a pundit. It emerged organically, attached to screenshots and clips, repeated because it felt self-evident. Receipts don't lie. It was not an attack. It was an observation. In politics, accusations can be disputed, motives questioned, intentions reinterpreted. Paper is harder to argue with. When read aloud, calmly, on camera, it acquires a weight that even the most skilled performer must reckon with. AOC never answered the questions Patel posed. She did not need to, from a strategic standpoint. Answering them would have required acknowledging the gap between rhetoric and record, and that gap was not something she was prepared to close publicly. Instead, she moved forward, as politicians do, carrying both the momentum of her base and the burden of a moment she could not fully control. Patel did not pursue her further. He did not need to. He had placed the facts into the public domain. What happened next was not up to him. In the end, the hearing became less about immigration or the FBI, or even the two figures at its center. It became a case study in what happens when preparation meets performance, when someone accustomed to directing the narrative encounters someone intent on documenting it. The cameras captured the exchange, the internet amplified it, and the public absorbed it in fragments. Some saw vindication. Others saw betrayal. Many simply saw complexity where they had once seen clarity. That was the real outcome. Not a knockout, not a victory lap, but a complication. A reminder that politics, like law, eventually circles back to the record. And when it does, the person who has read it most carefully tends to fare better than the person who assumed it would never be read aloud. The hearing ended with the sound of a gavel, but its effects did not. They moved quietly, steadily, through conversations and calculations, through trust gained and trust questioned. They lingered in the space between what was said and what was shown. And long after the clips stopped trending, that space remained, waiting for the next moment when someone would open a binder, turn a tab, and read.